Welcome to the third video in this series. At this point, you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed with everything about exposure and the different cameras, but hopefully by this point you understand that making choices in your videography is going to allow you to make different results in whatever you're choosing to film. And really all the stuff about frame rates and exposure is going to take you some time to absorb, but once you start to understand it, you're going to just be able to execute better those videography opportunities that you have. So if nothing else right now, just focus on whatever you're wanting to film and try to get best at choosing that shutter angle and the exposure that's going to make that situation the best possible. Now, for this video, I'd really encourage that you watch the audio level 1, level 2, and the lighting level 1 and level 2 videos, because those are really going to give you some foundational elements that will help make this a little bit more sensible, because I'm going to walk through two things in this video. One, it's going to be about composition. How do you actually make the frame look good? How do you frame up by your camera the actual scene that you're seeing in front of you? And then number two, how do you understand focal lengths with digital SLRs? Now again, when we talk about mirrorless cameras and digital SLRs, those are just the same thing, but they're a lot different from your broadcast camera, because a broadcast camera you can zoom in and out, and a digital SLR or a mirrorless camera, you have to choose the right lens for the right circumstance. So here's the first part where we're just going to talk about composition. If you want to learn just about focal lengths, you can feel free to jump ahead in the video to that point. With videography, there are so many choices, as we've just talked about, and composition is no different. In composition, you're really just thinking about, how do I want this to look to the viewer? Now, obviously that involves everything we've talked about so far with exposure and frame rates and all those kind of things. But specifically, composition is about how it looks within the frame. So there's a lot of ways that you can manipulate what the viewer sees based upon how you basically set up your camera and your subject. So the first one we're going to talk about is the most classic one for composition, and that's the rule of thirds. So as you can see on your screen right now, I've divided this screen into a rule of thirds. Just to break it down, what the rule of thirds is effectively about is placing your subject not squarely in the middle of the frame. And again, I'm doing that right now. That's not always what you want, but oftentimes with interviews, it makes it look a lot more dynamic. And depending on how I want the viewer to see this, I might want to place my subject somewhere within those rule of thirds. So for instance, if I was to do a video interview, I might want to set my person I'm interviewing to one side of the rule of thirds. Additionally, what's really good about that, and what's a good thing to think about, is have the person talk into the frame. So that is, give a little bit more room in the frame rather than choking the person to the left if they're talking already out that way. It will help make your interview look a little bit more dynamic. It will create a sense of depth that might not otherwise be there. Speaking of depth, one of the most important things to good composition is creating a sense of depth with your subject. So there's a lot of ways you can do that. Lighting, the lens you choose, and then specifically how you set up the scene. Now, a rule of thumb I always give my students is don't put the person right on the background. Sometimes you have no choice. You might be interviewing someone in a small office, or you might just have confines of a very small studio, and then you have to deal with it that way. But if you have any choice, try to pull the person from the background and allow the camera to give a little bokeh to that background, or to help separate that person from the background. You can darken that room and just have a few practical lights or some kind of fill light that will help to make the person stand out from the background. That can be really effective, and it starts to make your video look more cinematic and less amateurish. I've seen it a million times where someone basically backs the person against a wall, shines a really bright light onto them, and it looks like a super awkward interview. Plus, the shadow's really harsh against that background, and it doesn't look good. By having a deep background, the light will fall on the subject, and you won't have any of those shadows behind the person that don't look great on film. Speaking of interviews, part of composition is varying things. Now, this is kind of a cheat because it's really more about how many cameras you have and the different angles. But if you have two cameras, it's really important how you set those up. The main thing you don't want to have is you don't want to have two cameras that cross the subject. I've seen this before when people set up interviews early on because they're just not really sure where to throw the cameras, and so they just put them anywhere. And in doing so, you have this kind of like cross video look. And the thing that's disorienting sometimes to the viewer, even though they might not be able to see it explicitly or express it explicitly, is that suddenly the person being interviewed is looking one way and then the other way. And it starts to look like, you know, the interviewer was moving around the room. It's a little bit disorienting. So it's really important that you set up your cameras on the same side. And generally, and this is an added composition technique, if it's a more dramatic video where you have a 45-degree lighting angle and you have a shadow side of the face, you want to have your cameras on the shadow side of the face. So shoot the shadow side is always the rule of thumb you can hold on to there. That creates a much more dramatic look, and sometimes it can be also a little bit more flattering to the speaker because they don't have to see in bright light any kind of like maybe little flaws, you know, things that might make them not look flattering. Now, this is all to say that is for a dramatic shoot. If you're shooting something really high key, you want a lot of lighting, you want it nice and bright, then that rule might not apply. Additionally, if you're doing something like this, which we might call like a talking head video, then you probably want something very straight on and you want the speaker talking directly into the camera. In the setup that's more dramatic with two cameras, you typically want the speaker talking to an interviewer who's just off camera. And that way, it doesn't feel like they're just talking directly to the camera. Again, there's so many ways you can do this, and there's not one single right way. And if you watch stuff on, you know, any of the big streaming channels, you can often see how people do it different ways, and it can work out really well. But ultimately, I'll say, just because it can work out really well to have different angles, don't just think, therefore, you can do anything and it'll work out well, if that makes sense. Just because you don't have a plan doesn't make it good, right? Even people who are doing something different are planning it that way, and therefore it can lend itself to an overall aesthetic that they're going for. The next thing that's really important to understand about cameras, specifically for videography, and it applies to photography, is the camera level. So that is, if your subject is standing or sitting in this case, what level do you put your camera at in relation to the person who is speaking? So you have three real options here. And of course, there's different degrees to which you do this. So very extreme or just kind of subtle. So on the most extreme, you could put a camera literally above the head of your speaker and it would show the top of their head. Or you could put it in the ground below them and it would show them from like what we would maybe call like an insect's view. And those two are very extreme and are rarely used unless you're going for a very specific kind of effect. However, the more subtle versions of that are used frequently. And the distinction is this. If you want someone to feel pretty normal, pretty natural, fairly authentic to maybe who they are, you want to keep your camera level to their face because that's going to give the most classic natural look of the individual. So you'll mount it on a tripod or however your camera's mounted, and you'll keep that level or parallel with their face. If you want that person to seem small for whatever reason, maybe you want to make them look less significant. Maybe they're talking about something that made them feel small in the world, whatever reason you might have. Then you can place the camera slightly above the individual. So you can have the camera raised and pointed down at them. That's going to make them look smaller in the scene and a little bit weaker, a little bit less powerful in that circumstance. Again, there's reasons you might break that rule, but that's just generally how it applies. Thirdly, you can place the camera below the individual if you want them to feel powerful. So I often will refer to this as the superhero camera placement because it will make them look kind of grand and powerful and all those things. Now, I've often seen this also used as the B cam to the A cam, meaning the A cam is set up level with the subject, but the beat cam might be set up across the room and give a wider perspective to the person if they're sitting at a chair or they're sitting on a stool, whatever that might be. It kind of gives almost a behind the scenes look, but it also makes them feel like they're real in the world and they're just not in like a studio on a camera. So that can be effective for that means. But if you just have one camera and you place it below the speaker, they're going to look bigger. They're going to look a little bit more dominating, a little bit more powerful. So your camera placement matters for how it makes the viewer see the individual. So to wrap up composition, that was the most simplistic, simple way to talk about composition. There are so many ways to think about composition, and there's so many advanced techniques that can ultimately manipulate what your viewer sees. The key is that you're thoughtfully going through that. So when you're storyboarding, you should be thinking about how not only your frame looks, how much you fill the individual in the frame, but also where the individual is within the frame. There is a lot to be said about framing and how to frame a person, and there's tremendous videos that link through that. So if you're curious about how to frame a person and what that might look like based on how big the person is in the frame, I'll leave a link to that video here, and there's some links in the more advanced cinematography overviews for my courses. One of the things that affects composition significantly is your focal length. Now, you don't always get to choose focal length depending on your camera. However, on certain cameras, you'll see focal length described kind of in two ways. One way is it'll be called just zoom, like this generic kind of zoom. And your camera on your phone might be this way, where you can tap in, I've heard students say, let's take a 0.5 picture. On my camera, there's a 0.7, there's a 1x, there's a 4x, and you have different zoom capabilities. That is all focal length and how far in you're zooming with something. On a broadcast camera, they have the same kind of structure, but with a nicer lens. So in this case, for instance, it says there's an 18 times clear zoom. I don't know the difference between clear zoom and blurry zoom. It seems like it should all be clear zoom. But in this case, with rocking this rocker on the broadcast camera, I can zoom in and zoom out very quickly. And for that reason, a broadcast camera is really convenient. This will work well for video shoots if you understand composition and how to zoom. This can be a great camera. Cameras like the DJI OSMO are also really good, but remember they're limited. So I think the zoom on this is like 2x. You can basically zoom in twice, and it's pretty minimal. Otherwise, you're really just limited to walking up to someone to zoom in. So we're going to disregard this as far as our conversation about zoom. Instead, we'll focus on really how zoom or how focal length works predicated on a digital SLR or a mirrorless camera. So we talked about this early on when choosing your camera and your gear, but the benefit of mirrorless cameras, whether or not they are cinema level cameras or something more hobbyist level like this A6400, is you can switch out your lens and quickly swap to a different kind of lens, which gives you different options. Now, in the lens world, and it's very complex, so I'm just going to keep it really simple. There are really two kinds of lenses. One is called a prime or a fixed lens. So for instance, what I'm shooting on now on my camera that's filming me is a prime 20mm lens. We would understand that to be a pretty wide angle lens, and it's fixed, meaning you can't zoom in. This kind of lens is a variable lens, and you can actually zoom in by twisting this dial here. There's nothing on the actual camera like there is on our broadcast camera that will zoom in. Now, again, there's exceptions to that, and some cameras and some lenses pair up to allow you to digitally zoom. But by and large, on most digital SLRs or mirrorless cameras that you're going to work with, you will have to rotate a ring on the camera to make it zoom in. So a focal range will range from, very wide open, as we would describe it, meaning you get a wide field of view. And that might be something like 10mm at its most open. And it goes even below that. But most of the time you're going to deal with something that's maybe 16mm or 18mm. And again, that's a really wide zoom, so you get a really broad shot of the scene. Then as you zoom in going forward, you're going to go through focal ranges like 24 millimeters. A classic is 35 millimeters and 50 millimeters, upwards to 85 millimeters, 135, 200, 400, 800. You can have this whole spectrum. Generally, in videography, you can find yourself staying within 16 millimeters to 85 millimeters, maybe up to 135, and being perfectly comfortable. The benefit of a camera like this, and what you get with a kit lens, as this is described, is that telephoto range from 18 to 135 on this camera without switching out lenses. That's really beneficial because this will allow you to shoot most of the things you want to shoot with just one single easy lens to use. The drawbacks of that, and why people don't necessarily love these kit lenses, are multifaceted. But the quick answer to that is this will have a more closed aperture on the lens, and therefore it doesn't let as much light in. So if you're in a dimly lit room, you often want to be able to drop your aperture to gather as much light as possible to make sure your sensor can read that. If you're not sure exactly why, you can go back to our level 2 overview of what ISO is and why you might get more noise in your video. That has to do with, of course, the ISO, the shutter speed, the shutter angle, but also primarily the aperture. So, when using this, you have to think through what your ultimate goal is. Do you want to frame up a wide area? And in that case, like this lens, I might use a 20 millimeter focal length. And this lens and this camera, by the way, are only about 2.5, maybe 3 feet from me. So I'm already getting this really wide area from just a minimal distance of my camera. If I could move that camera way back, I might not use a 20 millimeter lens unless I want to get like the whole shop in this scene. If I want to get really tight in on me, I could of course move the camera really close to me, for sure. The danger of that is at 18 millimeters or 24 millimeters, these wider angles, you do run a risk of getting kind of a rounding effect if your camera's really close to the individual. And the scene can feel a little bit round, you can have some distortion in there. You can correct a lot of that in post-processing, but it's a limitation. And again, this is about choices. So what you might want to do instead is have a camera set up and zoom in to something like 85 or at this maximum 135. The benefit of that is you're going to get what people like to see in cinematic viewing, which is that bokeh. That's where you get that blurring out in the background. That's beneficial because it looks not only more professional, but as we started talking about with composition, it separates the individual from the background, which is one of those things that from a viewer standpoint makes it feel cinematic. It makes it look professional when we separate that individual from the background. So in addition to your lighting, in addition to how you set up the individual away from the background, choosing the right lens will help to create that separation. And that's why you want to be thoughtful in how you choose to compose with multiple cameras. It can lend itself to a lot of really cool effects, so be thoughtful in that process. And while there's that drawback to a wide lens with that rounding, there's also a really big drawback to using something that's fully telephoto from far away. You might get obsessed with that bokeh quality of having that really blurred background, but it becomes harder and harder to handhold a camera and make sure it's not bouncy the longer the lens is. So if you have a focal length that's 200 millimeters and you're trying to handhold that and shoot something, it's more likely that you're going to see some bouncing in the video. Again, if that's your purpose, no big deal. But for most videography, that's not the purpose. So then you either have to get a tripod or a gimbal, and the gimbal will stabilize it just as the tripod will. That makes it harder though for portability and kind of run and gun shooting where you need to shoot something. But that's also why a little guy like this provides a great benefit. It already has the gimbal here to stabilize the lens, and you get that benefit of kind of a broader spectrum. So this is where it's really good if you're doing run and gun shooting to use something like a DJI OSMO versus perhaps something like a mirrorless camera, until you get to the point where you can have a really nice gimbal setup that's very expensive and you know how to use all that equipment. Nevertheless, for Nevertheless, if you want to compress the background and you want that really rich bokeh and you really want to isolate the face so that the viewer is really paying attention to that person, telephoto is often the way to go because it isolates them in the frame. If you want to show someone the room, if you want to create atmosphere around the individual, then a wider lens is often the way to go. Many times, as you get more advanced, it's just greatly beneficial to run with 2 cameras, and that way you get the best of both worlds, and you can switch it up for the viewer, which is nice if it's a longer documentary and the viewer's getting tired of staring at the person's face, like you might be right now. That's the basic overview of composition and focal length, and specifically how focal length affects composition. Again, there are so many nuances and so many rules that are broken in videography and in composition. So, as I say in all these, the best thing you can do is go out and practice and think about what your style is. And while you're watching videos, as you watch movies, as you watch anything on social media, think about how they composed it. How do you feel while watching that? And why does the composition lend itself to that feeling? Because my guess is there was intentionality behind that, and that's why you're feeling what you're feeling while you're watching it. I hope you've enjoyed this quick 3-part overview of the basics of videography equipment and how that goes into it. Now, there are plenty more series for you to go through. So there's audio, there's lighting, and then the biggest one is probably Premiere. I also have more of a cinematography video series that that supposes that you Now, I also have a cinematography series that presupposes that you understand all of these basics. So we start jumping into a whole bunch of more complex elements of cinematography and what makes something look good versus what makes something look maybe a little bit too amateurish. Thanks for watching. Good luck with your own video, and I'll talk to you later.